Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. I'm Melody Rudenko. I'm a mitigation specialist with the Oregon Department of State Lands. I'll be providing the information on our grant program and answering the questions that you have about that program. Again, I am recording this session and we do plan to post it to the DSL website. That's usually through a YouTube link because DSL has a YouTube channel where we post videos. And that's so that folks who aren't able to attend will still have the same information on the program, as well as hearing the Q&A part. And again, at the end of the information I have to provide you, we'll have quite a bit of time for question and answer. So please hold any questions that you have until that final slide. And thank you for keeping yourself on mute until then. It looks like everybody's pretty familiar with the controls. Everyone was able to do that. If you do want to ask a question during the question and answer session, there is a raise hand function that we can use under the reactions. If you've called in on the phone, the way of doing that is *9. And if you wanted to raise your hand during the slides, that's fine. I'll probably wait to answer those until that Q&A session, but Zoom does track the order when people answer questions. We have also kept the direct chat function accessible. So if you needed to send me a written question instead of asking one through like the video unmuted, you can also do that throughout the presentation and I'll answer them during the question and answer part. So with all that housekeeping done, I will get rolling with the slides. There we go. Today, I was going to discuss first who our agency is, a little bit about us, then what the source of these grant funds, the Payment-in-Lieu grant funds is, what our eligible project types are, what priorities and criteria we have for grant projects, what the application process and timeline is, outline of what the roadmap is for a project, like how long it would take and what our expectations would be. And then we'll end with that question and answer session when you guys can answer any of the program questions that you might have. And we will ask that any specific project questions are saved for like an email or a phone call with me outside of this meeting. So to begin with, a little bit about the Oregon Department of State Lands. Oregon DSL is responsible for the administration of Oregon's removal fill law. And that law protects wetlands and waterways and the functions that they provide. This regulatory role is a process of the public entities that would like to impact a wetland or a waterway apply for a permit to do that with our agency for the state law piece. And in order to do those impacts, we require replacement or mitigation. And that mitigation has to be for the lost area of the wetlands or waterways, as well as the functions and values. And wetlands, waterways, it's really all aquatic resources in Oregon. We just often shorten it to wetlands and waterways because those are the two most common types of aquatic resources that people impact in Oregon. Applicants do have the option of completing their own mitigation project as part of their process. When they apply to impact a wetland, they can create a wetland or restore a wetland. We'll talk more about that in a minute. In some parts of the state, we also have private and public mitigation banks, and that option, a permittee can purchase mitigation in the form of a credit if the type of their impact, if the type of wetland or stream at that bank matches what's being lost through their impact. And then the last mitigation option is where this source of funds for this grant comes from. And that's payment-in-lieu mitigation. And the way that works is a permittee pays into the Oregon Removal Fill Mitigation Fund. And I have more on that in the next slide. But it's important for us to discuss that in a little bit of detail so folks understand the requirements we put on the grant and how that relates back to mitigation. So Payment-in-Lieu is a statewide fund. Excuse me for a minute. There we go. Sorry about that. So it's a statewide mitigation fund that we have been managing since the 90s. And this management and use of the fund is outlined in state administrative rule. If the federal regulatory agency, which is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, that also regulates wetlands and waters of Oregon and the rest of the U.S., is requiring mitigation, this option doesn't work. So that second bullet point, when stating that Payment-in-Lieu mitigation only meets state requirements as non-404 mitigation, what we're getting at is if there's federal mitigation required, this would not be an option that an applicant could use. So that kind of limits how many people can use and can pay into this fund. And this is really meant to be the last resort for applicants when there's no opportunity to do permittee responsible or buy bank credits or minimize to the point where they don't need mitigation. The payments into the fund are typically pretty small because they're associated with small impacts. It tends to be, very, very small fills, very small amounts of money that are collected kind of sporadically over time. And we track that money by the location and by the aquatic resource type. And that is because we have to replace those lost resources, those lost functions at the location where they were needed, where they were lost. So we have a pool of money that's being tracked based off of basin and resource type. So all the dollars have those assigned categories associated with them. There is a formula used to calculate the cost of that mitigation payment, and it's based on the cost of land at the location of impact, as well as the known cost for restoration projects in that basin. And that is based off of the excellent OWEB data that is regularly provided and updated that we can use statewide. But all that to say that it does take time to accumulate funds within a basin that's sufficient to support a mitigation project because they're coming in small payments. So that's part of why we say this is an option of last resort because of that delay in accumulating enough funds to fund a project. There's that lag time before the projects can actually spend the money to replace what's lost. But over the last 20 years, we have funded 31 projects all over the state, and we've had a big variation in how much the projects cost. And as you can see on the slide, so our least expensive project was only a request for $2,000, and then our most expensive was $297,000. So that's our range at this point. The key thing that we consider when looking at project proposals and costs is how much natural resource gain or replacement can we achieve with the funds being asked for. And that's because we need to have that be equivalent to the resource loss associated with those funds. It's like balancing a scale of what's lost and what we're gaining. So within each basin within the state, there's a certain amount of funds we've collected and a measured amount and type of resources that have been lost that we're trying to replace within the basin. So currently for the Rogue Basin, we've collected $369,000, and that is associated with 7 acres of wetland loss. And so that's why Rogue Basin is the target of this current outreach effort we're doing to try and get the funds spent. Typically, we will just accept grant applications at throughout the year. We don't have like a specific annual application cycle like a lot of grant programs. But once we reach a level like this where it could really fund a project, we put more effort into outreach and trying to get folks to apply for those funds. And so that's the notification you all saw through email requesting these letters of interest for a grant program project so that we can get these funds spent. But one of the reasons I think it's important to explain this source of funding before we get into the details of the application process, and I think it's important for applicants to understand it, is that we do have some specific requirements that are different than a traditional restoration grant program. And it's because of that tie back to mitigation and that tie back to resource loss that we have those special requirements. So for our eligible wetland project types, we at DSL have in rule some specific definitions for mitigation methods that is probably unfamiliar to a lot of the natural resource community who do like net benefit projects. And we really need these definitions because, you know, unlike the voluntary habitat conservation projects, those are typically 100% gain in natural resource functions. These projects, these mitigation projects, are always associated with a quantified loss of area and function. And so we need to be able to quantify those resource gains to assure the replacement. And the easiest way for us to do that is parsing out these different mitigation methods. And so the first method that we have listed on the slide is restoration. And that is a term that I would say that the natural resource community often applies to most types of natural resource conservation projects, but we have a very specific definition. And that is that for wetlands, it's a location that was formerly a wetland and is being turned back into one. And so an example of that could be a wetland that was filled historically, filled with dirt or other materials. And to restore that wetland, that material is removed. Another example of restoration could be a wetland that was artificially drained through ditching or sometimes tiling. Tiling typically doesn't completely drain a wetland. Ditching sometimes does, but those are examples of a former wetland that could be restored by reversing or rectifying that artificial drainage of that wetland. And so for those examples, soils and hydrology information is very important to confirm that the conditions of were formerly wetland but are not currently wetland. And the restoration projects will result in both a gain of wetland area and a gain of wetland function, because currently that location that was formerly a wetland is considered zero wetland area because it's currently functioning as upland or possibly a developed habitat, you know, a developed area, and not having those wetland functions. And so when determining how much gain we could measure through a restoration project, we typically think of that as simply a one-to-one exchange. So what that means is that 7 acres of wetland restoration would replace 7 acres of wetland loss. Creation, which I realize isn't on this slide, but creation is another form of mitigation method. And that is when we take an upland location that was never previously a wetland and we alter it to become a wetland. And now these projects are always considered risky because of the innate challenge of making a wetland out of an upland area. Even with that risk though, creation does result, if successful, it does result in a gain of wetland area and wetland function, though it's often slow to develop those functions given just the nature of wetland soils and how long it takes those to form and provide the full functional suite of wetland functions. And so because of that temporal delay, when determining how much wetland gain we would have through creation, we think of that in exchange of 1.5 to 1, and that's because of those upland soils, or in other words, 10.5 acres of wetland creation would replace 7 acres of wetland loss. That's what that measurement works out to. And then enhancement, our second on the list here, hydrologic enhancement projects. Enhancement is when a wetland has had its hydrology degraded, typically by humans, is improved by rectifying that hydrologic degradation. So an example of this could be similar to that drained wetland I mentioned earlier, but this could be a wetland that had ditches or tiles constructed through it that did lower the water table, maybe artificially draining the surface water, but it was still functionally a wetland, still wet enough to qualify as a wetland and have wetland functions. And so this enhancement project to enhance that wetland hydrologically would need to address that hydrologic degradation, such as filling in the ditches or blocking the ditches that are draining it or breaking the tile that's draining it. And so enhancement projects don't result in a net gain of wetland area, but do have a net increase in wetland functions. And so because we only have the gain in the functions, we're not actually gaining any wetland area. There's a different calculation, a larger one than the other two methods I've discussed. So when determining how much gain we have through an enhancement project, we typically think of that as 4.5 to 1. And that's when wetland soils would need to be disturbed to fix that hydrologic degradation. The ratio would actually be quite a bit lower if you could rectify the hydrologic losses without disturbing the soils significantly. But in other words, that ratio of 4.5 to 1 works out to about 3.5 acres of wetland enhancement to replace 7 acres of wetland loss. And then the final method I was going to discuss is preservation. And now that is the permanent protection of a wetland that has exceptional features that is also threatened with loss. Typically that loss or that threat is development. Commercial, residential, some sort of development that would eliminate that aquatic resource from functioning. We're very selective about what qualifies for preservation because when you use that form of mitigation, there is a net loss of wetland acres and functions. And so the ratio is quite high because of that net loss, because when doing preservation, there isn't a gain in wetland area or function. You're just preserving it as it currently exists. And so we would expect about 10 to 1 for the calculation for exchanging wetland losses for preservation of existing wetland. In other words, that would be 70 acres of preservation to replace 7 acres of wetland loss. And then finally, I did want to talk about a few projects that are ineligible for mitigation funding because they do often get, excuse me, confused with wetland enhancement projects, and our enhancement focuses specifically on hydrologic rectification. But other projects that may be eligible for other types of grants but are not eligible for mitigation funds would be including projects that consist just of non-native or invasive species control or planting of native species. In addition, wetland projects need to have a natural, not a managed source of hydrology. So not ones that depend on water that's coming through storm drain runoff, no piped in water, other water control structures that need a lot of maintenance. These would need to be self-sustaining sites. So those are the two broad categories of projects that we sometimes see that wouldn't be eligible for mitigation funding. Our project criteria and priorities for this grant program include a project that uses methods and techniques that have just a track record or proven successful in using in natural resource projects, especially in mitigation projects. So something that's been tested and documented to work as a technique. Sites that are sustainable, specifically that has a sustainable hydrology. It's very important to assure that they'll be adequate water at the site in perpetuity, having that reliable natural water source without a high maintenance need. Projects need to result in a net gain, as I described on that previous slide, because this is a mitigation project. So those methods that I talked about, the restoration, creation, enhancement, preservation, it's important that a project falls into one of those methods, those categories, because this is associated with a loss of aquatic resources. So we need to have those kind of measurable gains. The project designs should focus on reestablishment of natural processes, and as well as the native species or plant communities that would have been found historically at that site or in that area. So focusing on maybe not returning to historic conditions, since that's not usually possible, but restoring to a natural process and natural conditions, natural species that we would have found in the area. We also do consider the capacity and expertise of the project team. That's some information we'll ask for as part of the application process, and it is something we do look at and consider. For siting of the project, the surrounding land use needs to be supportive of the project goals without like a conflict. So like if the intent was to be a site where it could hold a lot of flood water, we wouldn't want the project site to have conflicting land use with flooding adjacent properties, as an example. Just one pretty straightforward example. There's other examples of that kind of conflicting land use, but also we wouldn't want surrounding land use that could degrade or harm the site. There is a requirement for the mitigation projects, the grant projects funded with these mitigation dollars, to be monitored to confirm project success. That's one of our requirements, as well as long-term protection over the site to assure that the functions exist in perpetuity. And that would be that site protection. The minimum requirement is just a deed restriction. We do prefer if folks have the opportunity to put a conservation easement on a property. That's an even stronger protection on that site. We also like to prioritize projects that target regional conservation priorities. For example, restoration of wetlands that function to improve water quality or address some of the recognized water quality impairments that are documented in the Rogue Basin, or wetlands that are functioning to support native fish species that we know are in threat in the Rogue Basin, are just a couple of examples. There are other priorities within the basin that are documented in watershed plans and other natural resource documents. So that's not a requirement, but it does make a project a higher priority when they can address those issues. And we also have a preference for sites that have connectivity to other habitat corridors or protected lands, just something that boosts the value of a site when it has that connectivity. And it's something we look at when reviewing proposals. So next, for the application process and timeline, the first step we have for this current request for proposals is to submit a letter of interest. We were hoping that addressing it this way would reduce the amount of initial work folks had to put into a project and allow us to do a high-level screening to see if then a full grant proposal was something worth everyone committing to. And so the letter of interest is a high-level overview of the project concept. We're asking for a max of 3 pages of text, plus the attached maps, drawings, photos, what other information, exhibits necessary to demonstrate the project site. All the specific details of what should be included in that letter are outlined in the grant announcement that we sent out starting on page 4. And what you can do to submit that letter is simply email it to me by the end of the day, February 1st of this year. Letters of interest submitted late will still be considered. They will just be a lower priority. We will give a higher priority for people that meet that deadline that we've set. For the next step after we've gotten those letters is that DSL staff will review the letters of interest and consider how those projects meet the guidelines and addresses priorities as I've outlined in the previous slides and described to you. We'll actually kind of do some really rough estimates of how much gain a project could provide in considering if it would be something eligible. Our staff may contact project sponsors to see if we can set up a site visit to help us look at feasibility of the project. But all strong candidates that have a acceptable proposal will be invited to submit a full proposal, and details on what information should be included in the full proposal are also listed in the grant announcement that we sent. Pages 5 through 7 have those details. That full proposal, there's a maximum of 5 pages of written text, plus all the attachments, the maps, the designs, anything else photo wise that you want to include. And the level of detail for this, it is outlined, but it's really a conceptual plan level, and then some detail on technical feasibility, how the implementation would work, and some of the long-term management details, like the plans for long-term management. But again, at a conceptual level. And then once we've reviewed those applications, we should be able to make a final funding decision by the end of summer 2022. And then we would start working on the grant agreement with the applicants. And that's kind of a back and forth process. So timeline wise, what I would expect is these projects, like funds in hand, could get rolling in early spring of 2023. And then for the general project roadmap from the starting point to the very end, when the grant agreement is completely fulfilled, is really this outline here on the screen. And it's begins with sort of the project planning phase of coming up with the design, documenting the baseline conditions. This may include a delineation and other surveying details, going through the permitting process. And then for implementation, the construction, planting, post-construction survey or as-built, and then that report being sent to DSL. And then the next stage is the monitoring. And it's really important when considering your project to work the cost of the monitoring reporting after project construction into the project budget, because it is something that we require. And often how it's handled is in the contract, after an entity has the grant award, we mock up a contract, and in the contract there are deliverables, and those are typically those monitoring reports at the post-construction stage. And so what we see is typically a report gets submitted, I review it and distribute it. As part of that report, there's a fund request that covers those reporting actions, the plant monitoring, the writing of the report, travel, whatever the costs were that you put in the budget, and we reimburse that cost when we receive that monitoring report is typically how it works. So it's important to put all of those requirements into the budget rather than just focusing the budget on construction. So I know some grant funding opportunities can be hard to find money to do the monitoring, and it's kind of the reverse with us. We really want that monitoring done to confirm the success of the project. And as part of that monitoring, you're actually evaluating the site against some set performance standards that will work out with you before the implementation of the project. So there's a way of measuring and quantifying that a project was successful. And then the last piece, the long-term protection and the stewardship, is deed restrictions are often done like before projects get constructed or finalized right after construction once you have a surveyed map. And stewardship isn't a requirement, but it is nice to have a long-term steward and endowment and all those details to help manage a site and monitor a site long-term. But that's not our minimum requirement, is just that deed restriction that I mentioned before. Additionally, we don't have requirements for match funds because, again, these dollars are from impacts from mitigation. So we don't require any alternative source. We can fully fund a project from conceptual phase through long-term stewardship and endowment from start to finish. So no match is required, but we have had quite a few projects that combined the funding or coupled the funding with other grants, including OWEB grants. And so that is possible. What we do is we just need to track the gains associated with the mitigation funds separate from the funds coming from the nonprofit grants, so that none of the resource grants or none of the resource gains paid for by the nonprofit grants are counted as a mitigation gain under the DSL program, so that we're only counting the gain of area, the gain of function associated with the money that we spent. We don't want to take credit for what another organization funded. But again, there is a track record to fall back on for doing that. We've worked with OWEB a lot. So there's no one would be pioneering a new method by combining different grant funds if that was something someone wanted to pursue. And then for the next part, we're going to do some question and answer. We have plenty of time for everyone to ask their questions. And I do want to make sure that we have, we focus on the funding opportunity and process, like in general, rather than specific project eligibility questions. If you do have those kinds of questions, you can email me or call me with them, and we can discuss one-on-one specific projects rather than during this time. So ways that you can ask a question, we have the chat function. You can directly send a message to me that has a written question, or you can use under the reactions icon, you can use the raise hand function, and I can call on you, have you unmute, introduce yourself, and ask your question. So I will look now to see if we have raised hands. I'm not seeing any. I will wait for a few more minutes just because I want to make sure everybody has a chance. I'm not seeing any. Oh, there's one. There was a question about mitigation eligibility and our checklist for mitigation and whether or not it's relevant to this process. It is relevant, though it's a little obscured how it's relevant and compared to like when someone's familiar with going through the permitting process and perhaps doing like a permitting responsible mitigation site. The eligibility piece, the requirements is to match location and type. And How we've handled that with payment in lieu with these dollars is tracking it by basin. So it's a larger location than what we would typically look at for a permanently responsible replacement. But we also have tracked the funds by type. So within my data, I know how many acres of different wetland type. We track them by Cowardin and by HGM. And so I do have that data to try and get that eligibility match. What we typically find is a lot of variation within a basin as to what kinds of wetland losses we had. But if we were seeing a trend of, for example, if in a basin forested wetlands were disproportionately lost and paid for through PIL, then we would want to target that wetland type with our payment in lieu grant project. For the Rogue, it was variable. In fact, a lot of it was simply listed as emergent flats wetlands. But it was variable. We had quite a few different HGM and Cowardin classifications. So we are looking for diversity, but honestly, a very sustainable project. It is probably one of our highest priorities, given the challenges of doing any kind of conservation activity in our current climate cycles. Something really sustainable, it would be probably the most eligible, if it's within the basin and just has a good chance of success and sustaining function in perpetuity. Looks like we have some more. I'm not seeing hands, but I do see some more written questions. Thank you. Oh, there's a good question about the grant opportunity, how it comes around and how it's offered. So we collect these funds sporadically. It's through the permitting process, and I track that. And we will sometimes go a few months without getting any payments into the fund, and then we will have 2 or 3. And sometimes they're quite small, a few $100s, and sometimes they are quite a bit larger. So all that to say, it takes a lot of time to build up enough funds in a basin to pay for a mitigation project. So we don't really have a regular grant cycle and distribution of these funds. What we do have is an open door for accepting applications at any time. This current request is really to try and get a bunch of interest in someone sponsoring a Rogue Basin project, because it's the basin with the most funds right now and the most need of wetland replacement. Hopefully this will be successful, and we'll, once we've worked through it, put out another request for letters of interest for the next basin. But all that to say, if there's a project in a different basin, it can be submitted to us at any time. It would be a really good idea to contact us first to make sure that funds are available, because not every basin in the state has funds available, because we have historically funded quite a few projects. So if those funds all get spent, or if we simply just haven't collected funds in a particular basin, because given the eligibility challenge of someone paying into payment in lieu and it being sort of the last resort for mitigation, it's not used that often. So yes, other folks can apply, but we don't necessarily have funds. So it's good to coordinate with us ahead of time. Okay, the next question was similar about the likelihood of funding a project outside the Rogue Basin. So the dollars that we have for the Rogue Basin will be spent in the Rogue Basin. We will not spend those in another basin. But again, if there are projects in other areas, people can reach out to me and I can look up our current amount of dollars for that basin and our current amount of natural resource loss associated with those dollars. But the money earmarked for the Rogue Basin will be spent in the Rogue Basin. Next, basin priorities. I was looking this morning. I think we have quite a few dollars in the Hood River area. Interestingly, it looked like Umatilla suddenly had a bump in dollars. That surprised me, and I made a note to myself to go and do some research. It wasn't, it was just surprising given the location that we had suddenly had like a bump in dollars there. There was one other, oh, Southwest Coast. It also, there's enough money accumulated that it could fund a project. So those are all basins that we're at the point with dollar amounts and amount of resource loss that we really want someone to come in with a project, and we'll likely go through the process of requesting proposals for those areas. Because so there's a question about putting information about what funds are available by basin on the website or by email request. It's best to just reach out to me directly to find out that information, because it's changing. I have to update the fund accounting documentation regularly and track those dollars and those resource types. So we don't have a way of integrating that into a website presentation that would be able to update as regularly as the fund amounts do. But I can very quickly access it. I've gotten that worked out. So anyone can reach out to me at any time to find out what basins have what amount of funds. And then a question about funds available in Coos Bay. Yes, Coos Bay is covered by that Southwest area. It's a lower amount of funds and a lower amount of resource loss. I don't have the number at the, like right in front of me right now where I can tell you what it is. But if you want to reach out to me after the webinar, I can certainly tell you what the funds are and what our priorities are for that basin as well, because our agency, it is our priority to spend all of the dollars that we bring in. It's just very challenging to have that happen quickly, or as quickly as we'd like. And that looked like the last message that was typed in. I'll give it another minute. Okay, I'm not seeing any new messages. The next slide has my contact info though. So if there's anything that you're still wondering about, be sure to, here we go. There we go. Copy down my email or my number and reach out with any other questions that come up, or if you want to discuss specific projects. I want to encourage everyone interested to talk to me about it. If you're worried that you might not have a good fit project, I don't want you to just turn and walk away from the program. Or if you're worried about some of our requirements, please reach out so I can talk through those with you, because we really want to encourage folks to apply and we really want to find a great project. So again, please reach out, please submit letters of interest and ask me any questions that you might have. I'm happy to be involved in discussions about these opportunities at any time. So I think that's everything. So I really appreciate you participating today. This was great, really great questions. And I think that's it from me. I will be ending the recording and stopping the slideshow. So please copy down the contact info before I do that. Have a great day, everyone.